I think investors are ultimately going to give pass to companies that don't give guidance. I mean, I don't think Okta's sort of pulling guidance means actually there's a downturn coming. It's just, I don't know how anyone could actually say what they expect for the next 2 quarters. But that being said, I do think 2026 is shaping up to be pretty good. So I not only do I think it's a good M&A environment next year, but we'll have deregulation, we'll have some visibility on taxes. I think the tariff drama is behind us, and the Fed, who's been on hold, is probably going to be dovish next year. I mean, to me, all of that means PE should be going up, and I think the $7 trillion of cash on the sidelines starts to get deployed. Bitcoin made an all-time high last week. Bitcoin peaked a month before the S&P did. So I do think this is telling us the S&P should be making all-time highs pretty soon. But it doesn't mean I think Bitcoin's capped as well. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that institutional adoption for Bitcoin's growing. I think that consumer awareness for Bitcoin actually is still pretty nascent. And so when we still have a visible demand coming and a fixed supply, I think it's a lot of upside for Bitcoin.
And that pushes prices up. But at the same time, we're getting a lot of unintentional support from Washington. I think the market today is reacting to the fact that the government has sort of said it's on board to grow deficits, to print more money, to expand the fiscal debt. And that's forcing people to look outside of fiat currencies to an alternative. Bitcoin is that alternative. I think this is the start of a major move. I think we're going to significantly exceed the previous all-time highs, and we're en route for another overturn. People want alternatives. I think that's adding significant flows. Even independent of that, though, you have this structural mismatch between new demand and supply with institutions coming in. So that's sort of like the cherry on top that's forcing us up today.
Matt, why is what's true for Bitcoin not true for the rest of the altcoins that we're watching?
Yeah, I think there's a real fundamental difference between Bitcoin and assets like Ethereum and Solana. Bitcoin is the world's digital gold. Its blockchain is designed to serve that purpose, and it's widely fits their goals. So plenty of people love BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager. Some people in a specialist market want a specialist expert who's been managing investor capital in this space for the past 7 years, who understands how markets move over time, who is there whether the market is up or down. So when we speak to financial advisors, when we speak to institutions about BitB, they want to align with a specialist that they know they can call and get on the phone. And extraordinarily positive for crypto. We've seen a 180-degree turn from the SEC, from anti-crypto to pro-crypto. We've seen a stablecoin bill moving forward in Congress. We've seen an executive order that established a Bitcoin strategic reserve. I do think the Trump meme coin on the margin is negative for crypto, but there is so much good news embedded in the market. In fact, I'd argue that one of the reasons we're surging today is there was so much positive news out of Washington in the first 3 months that it was sort of lost amidst concerns about tariff.
Nice stuff about me. That was just a great intro about kind of history and philosophy. And so thank you for that. Thank you for setting such a incredible stage. We could talk for many, many hours about this, but
it's
all of investing is about hypothesis formation, gathering data, testing the hypothesis, finding out where you're wrong and where you're right, and then reformulating a new hypothesis and testing again. And so I joke all the time that I've spent most of my career hanging out with the bad guys and gals, but the fringe people. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if you go back to the early use of computing, right? When governments were the only one that had computers, the only other people that had computers were the criminals. Who is the first user of the internet? Porn, kind of. I mean, okay, how about cell phones and pagers? Drug dealers?
Drug dealers, yeah.
I mean, because why? Well, because if you were a drug dealer, they didn't want to hand you a regular phone, right? They wanted you outside the system. If you were a cannabis seller, even though when it became legal, you couldn't get a bank account. So you had to migrate to these other systems. So on the fringe is where the new technology starts because, right? Yeah. With, Gordon Gekko. And how did Bud Fox win? He got information that other people couldn't get. Now, he stole some of it and he paid people for it and he would follow people around and, see what plane they got on because that was actually useful. I have Great story. There was a guy that I invested with. He was a hedge fund manager. He and his twin brother, both were hedge fund managers. And he was the first guy to buy Apple way ahead of everybody, like in single digits. And it's because the printing press came along and busted the monopoly. Information became transferable. People could read. They were illiterate. Now they were becoming literate, and you could print books and pass them around. Well, what happened? Media became the infrastructure, and state-owned and state-sponsored. Like in America, we say, oh, we're not state-owned. Oh, yeah, go back in my day and watch ABC, NBC, CBS. They said the same thing at 6 o'clock every night. Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather, they said the same thing in New York to send someone to BA, write a story, send it back. The editor edits, and she says, all right, fine. Page 17, if you're ingenious enough to get the newspaper and open to page 17, you could learn about the Argentinian election. Now, I want to know, is Milei going to win? I go to, Twitter. I'll never call it X. You go to Twitter. I watch a periscope of people standing in line in the rain for 2 hours chanting his name.
Yeah.
That guy's going to win. Believe in it. So you have to do work. You have to, form that hypothesis. You have to test that hypothesis. And my hypothesis testing was never like, I'm going to sit in a dark room and think of the next great thing. That's what I'll call a big E entrepreneur. I'm a little E entrepreneur. I like to look at new stuff and say, how's that going to make old stuff better, right? How is the internet? I remember 1996, I'm in South Bend, Indiana, working at Notre Dame. And we invested with this firm called Sequoia, which back then was not famous. 2 lines of code, now we had 1. Today, and counting, I'm going to be off by a little bit, but there's about 1.7 billion websites. Google owns half of them. Whoa, what are you talking about? Well, here's how it works. Every time you type a question into the search bar, it takes you immediately to a website that already has all the answers. Because lots of people have asked that question before. Now, if you happen to ask a unique question, which is really hard to do, it'll have to create a new website. And so think about it. If you type a question and it had to search around, and then it started to get better, and each innovation, whether that was the ability to create fire with a match, or whether it was the ability to harness the power of the sun or a neutron, whatever it was, each innovation made you a little better. And 100 years ago, there were almost no cars. Interestingly, most of them were electric. No one talks about that. And then Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller basically buried that technology for 100 years to sell oil. Because here's the crazy story. John D. Rockefeller, had Standard Oil. Well, he didn't have Standard Oil like we think of oil. It was kerosene lamp oil.
Yeah, exactly.
We didn't have electricity. And so he had these kerosene lamps, and he would pull the selling and installing mainframe computers. I came along in 1963. And 5 years later, there's an innovation in Silicon Valley around the microchip. And suddenly the center of the universe shifted from Boston, Massachusetts, where it was with Unisys and Burroughs and Digital Equipment Corp, to what is now Silicon Valley. And then I grew up in Seattle. So in 1982, there's an innovation around the personal computer. And Steve Ballmer's mom famously quipped, honey, why would you work for that company? No one ever wanted a computer in their house. Well, why did she say that? Because the Digital Equipment Corp in my town in Chapel Hill, it's about 90 seconds, right? I'm sitting in a traffic light, and I went to Travelocity and I bought a plane ticket. I'm like, okay, I'm in. I'm all in. If I can buy a plane ticket in 90 seconds from my car, e-commerce is going to be a big deal. So, and there's a great video of Michael Saylor talking about this, and he actually wrote a book about this, about what today is FANG or the Mag 7, 15 years ago, to be a quote unquote great investor. Mm-hmm. And someone asked him one day, he said, you have a model that uses the price of butter in Botswana. That has nothing to do with the S&P. He says, yeah, I know, but it's about 95% accurate in predicting the price movement. So I'm going to use it until it stops working. He's like, I don't give a shit what the data is. If the data has information I'm going to use it because that's my model. And so he had a processing or an analytical edge. Ken Griffin had a processing or analytical edge. And interestingly, this is funny. So we have a unique family. We have 2 older kids, 36 and 34, and then we have a caboose who's 14. So 20 years later, something happened, and we're blessed, and it's the greatest thing ever.
Awesome.
But my wife we had 20 years off. And so at the end of the day, I'd come home, she'd hand me new child. And, she's like, I'm going to go out for a couple hours. You were at work all day. So, which is fair, totally fair. And it gets less risky. So you start with the 60-40, but then you add 20% in private and, alternatives, although I hate that term. I would say alternative to what? People don't like alternatives.
Right.
Alternative music, alternative education, alternative they don't like it. So they put a little bit in when really, what's alternative about it? What does a hedge fund do? They buy stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities. Those are the 4 things you can own in the whole world. Stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities. Private equity, common stock, preferred stock, convertible bond. Real estate. Less rich every single day. It's the worst strategy. And that's what Markowitz proved. He said, you start with cash and you add bonds, which have an element of risk because a bond can default, right? A company can do poorly. And if you add high risk bonds, it's even more risky. But when you add them to a portfolio where they're uncorrelated, this is the key, when they zig, when the other zags, the risk of the portfolio goes down. So you think about it, okay, they don't pay the bills.
Right.
I'll give a good example. So everyone thinks that Yale is the best performing fund. And they're really good. And David Swenton, God rest his soul, was one of the best ever to do the game. But they're actually the 3rd best. Now, that's pretty good. Third is good. Right. And why were they so good? Well, they were 60-40, but they weren't. They were 80-20, but they weren't. They were really 90-10. I admire Bill because he said, I'm going to put 15% in cash to pay 3 years of spending, 85% in private, and most of it in venture. And even though his volatility was higher, he outperformed everybody by a lot. And so that's how we got to where we are today with digital assets and Bitcoin. So you didn't ask me this question, but I'll answer it anyway. In that $4 million, but he makes $200K from the university, and then Nike and TV and all that stuff pays the rest. And I thought he was going to try to convince me to stay arrogantly. Yeah, and I thought he was going to, say, we'll figure it out. No, he came out and he said, look, I'm surprised you lasted this long, honestly. I like you all to work together. So I hit that bid and he helped get us started. But what he taught me and what I talk about in Hedge Hunters is there are certain things that you look. So he always had courage of his convictions because he had done the work. So doing the homework was important. But the thing that people said that he did better than anyone was he could press the winners. He would double up. He would never double down, like never, ever. And he would always, and doubling up, it's by far, because it's against what Harry Markowitz taught us, right? You're supposed to rebalance every quarter and you're supposed to, so I kind of got black. So I gave him some money for his blockchain fund and that fund's up, it's like 11, 12 times. That's great. Yeah. Should have put money in the Bitcoin fund. That's up 300 times, but maybe it's even 350 times. But the key is that I didn't, but I did start to do work. And my aha moment was that I actually wrote about this. It's called the digital gold rush. When I realized that this technology was the price was $500. And I said, this is an interesting special situation. This is a 41-page letter. Yeah. I always wrote these long letters and people say, why do you read it? No one reads them. I said, they're not for them. They're for me. If I don't know what I wrote, how do I know what I think? So I write for me. And if you want to read it, great. I mean, not you personally, but anyone wants to read it, great. And so my PR person, no one's going to read that. I'm like, it's okay. I way after. And they were in, and they were honest, like white on rice. We hadn't even done anything yet. We just said, we're going to do this. We're going to raise a fund. Now, I will give them credit. The reason they came in was not to bust our ass. Because this was the regional group. This wasn't the people in Washington who were politicking. They said, right, we need to learn. And they didn't say it as clearly as that. But he is that, yes, stuff's going to get lost or stolen. Maybe the Nakamoto million never show up. Maybe the government does see some. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. He said it, because remember, it used to be he, she, they, but then he self-identified once as a he, so we know it's a he, or some number of he's, but there is at least one he. And he said, consider it a donations central. The name Satoshi means intelligence. Nakamoto is the name of families from the central provinces of Japan. Like, that's curiously close to CIA.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So then you dig a little further. Curiously, in 2006 or 7, I can't remember the exact year, I think it was 7, there is a money, Aaron. We need a judge to make sure that we keep our ledgers the same. Okay. But the problem is, if Mark's unscrupulous, he could bribe the judge to change the number. So we need a judge to judge the judge. Well, then he could bribe both people. So we need a judge to judge the judge. He says, well, we need everyone in history. That's a blockchain. So he was brilliant, Stanford. And so he's got 3, white paper notes. It works. And so it's such a beautiful and elegant system. It actually defies logic to think that one person could have got it all right. Think about this. The 51% attack will never happen. How do you engineer that as a single human being? How could you come up with this game theory to say there'll never be a 51% attack? Because the moment you achieve on this, and it has to do with the number of nodes, the number of users, number of wallets, number of transactions, and that today is around 100-ish thousand, 95 to 105, somewhere in that range. It's kind of tough to pin down. And that will continue to accrete over time. And every halving, we add a 0. We get 10 times bigger as a network. So we went from 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, 10,000 to 100,000. He doesn't want you to own this. So at the end of the day, 839 years, the banking industry, insurance, brokerage, title, it's a great run. It's over. Now, it's not over tomorrow. It's not over next week or next month, but it's over. And incrementally, bit by bit, that big orange Pac-Man is going to eat everything. And that's good. People say, well, you're not a real Bitcoin if you don't put 100% in. Like, shut the hell up.
Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and enabling post notifications for more content on crypto and digital assets. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps with the YouTube algorithm and keeps the content coming. Thanks for your support. Enjoy the video.